think what people will be surprised by when they watch Undone is that it's animated, yes, but it has real depth to it.
So what's up, people, and welcome to the final episode of the first season discussion for Undone. And this is for a bonus episode that came with the series. When I got this, I got two additional bonus videos. One was the trailer, so you've already seen that. But there was another bonus video which I found to be very interesting when I started looking at it. It was called The Evolution of Undone. And it talks about the art style and the technology used to create the very interesting, unique art style that this series went by. And I know some of you have mentioned that it wasn't particularly the style that you like, but I do have to admit that it was quite unique. And I enjoyed it. It felt like it gave depth. It gave a personality to the people who were coming out in the series, and yet it felt very retroactive and very classical in its style because they used oil painting sort of techniques to actually create the basically the illustrations. And so anyway, I wanted to talk about some of the information that came out with this episode. And since it is an art style discussion and not a discussion with regards to the story, at least not the majority of it, I did want to give you that warning in the beginning. If you're not interested in the art style, then just please go ahead and turn off this video and save yourself the trouble of finding that out at the very end, save yourself a few minutes, But if you're interested in the art style, then please, keep on going and I'll talk about it. Now, the one topic I did want to cover, which doesn't deal with the art style, is that I've heard from many of you that there is going to be a season 2. So that's great. I mean, I did talk about the fact that if it's going to end, it would be a nice place to close it with season 1's ending because it had such an open-ended closure that you could accept it in many ways. But if you're going to have season 2, I'll watch it. And I hope that they do a good methodology for it. From my perspective, and this is just my personal taste, so please take it with a grain of salt, is that I hope they continue to keep that mystery of whether Alma's condition is just purely psychological or if there is a real power, in the sense that now that we have both possibilities, I would like to see in the second series the question keeping on coming up. From some perspectives, it looks like it's just a completely psychological situation for Alma, that she is just making up in her head, but other situations possibly indicate that it is a real power. And of course, it will confuse her, and the confusion will probably cause a tremendous amount of tension amongst all the people around her. But at the same time, because we're living through it and we don't know as well, it'll confuse us as well, and it'll keep the open-ended nature of people who feel that they would like to have this be a real power for Alma, have it that way. And for the people who feel that, no, it's a psychological situation, that they could have it that way as well. And the question of whether that is the case, or whether or not that is the case, continues throughout the entire thing. And the confusion, of course, is good because of the fact that you get to see it from the main character's style. That a lot of times these are shown in the third person, and so you kind of tend to think, okay, well, it's just a figment of their imagination. But because it's from a first person perspective, and because it's kept open-ended, we get to live the confusion that probably the main character is having, the dilemma of her trying to figure out whether this is real or not, and the audience can try to live through that as well. And by keeping it that way, the audience themselves will feel exactly the same way as Alma. is this a figment of imagination? Am I going into a dementia sort of situation? Or is this really real? And do I have something that I need to work with? And with the audience feeling that way, you get to feel the same sort of confusion, the conflicts that Alma has. And I feel that that would be a really nice way of opening up season 2. Okay, so all this minutes time, and I didn't even talk about the bonus round. But anyway, I did want to mention and thank many of you that season 2 will be coming out. Okay, so if many of you felt the art style in the same way that I did, that it had a very retro and a very hand created technique, and yet it felt real. It felt like a real movie. It didn't feel like a bunch of images just stuck together. The expressions that came out through the faces was very advanced, and the images that they showed, not only in the dream world but in the real world, was very well rendered, considering that it felt like hand-drawn images. And I guess that was the point. That was the actual purpose of the producers to make it that way. And it was only after I started seeing this bonus round that they started telling me that the technology they used was a modern version of rotoscope. And I was like, wow, they use rotoscope. I haven't seen rotoscope for a long time, at least not where I was aware of it. And so I was like, interesting. But it wasn't just rotoscope that they did. And I could understand now why it has a very retro feel to it if they are using rotoscope. But they used it in a modern methodology, which is 3D computer-generated rotoscopy, if you want to call it that way, or rotoscope, right? Technology. And I was like, wow. Now that is really, really cool. And when you understand it that way, you look at the images that come out in the series, you look at it and appreciate it in a different way. You start seeing the nuances of going, no, now I understand where this is done that way. Now I understand why the visual effects is so modern. And now I understand, despite it being modern, why it feels so retro. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with rotoscope technology, it's a technology that dates back to a very, very early parts of film. And actually goes way before that and creates the technology where probably film was considered. And that is the chronophotographic zoopraxiscope technology. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's actually a relatively simple thing. It was a method where I guess still images were then moved together at a rapid pace to create a movement, similar to a flip book, except that it was done with a kind of a spinning movement. And it was developed by a gentleman named Edward Maybridge. And you may have seen one of these. I used to have one actually when I was a kid, and you could put it on your record player and it would actually create this image. But it looked like this, the traditional one looked like this, and it would have one image, that you could see. And the rest of it was when you spin it, it added to that one image. So you see horses, for example, and by spinning this lamp and looking at that one image, because it moved from the one still image to the next, it looked like the horse was running. And if you think about it, the original film was, of course, done with still shots, right? It's basically the film going down the movie projector, and it's moving at a certain rate, which made each individual images that were coming through the film look like the image was actually moving. And so that is, of course, the evolution coming from the chronophotographic zoopraxiscope technology. Now, rotoscope was an artistic methodology that took the advantage of film that was kind of developed by taking basically photos of a person as they moved, and the individual shots then were put together to create film. That's how movies were done until, of course, digital came along. Even a few years ago, that was how movies were done, right? And what advantage they had is, of course, then you could actually see the real person in their own animation. And what rotoscope did is then use that film to project it onto a screen, and seeing that screen for each individual shot would create what they would call, I guess, a cell image, right, and for animation. And the advantage of that is, especially in the older days when animation technology still wasn't really advanced, and so people had to basically hand draw each one of those cell renditions, it limited the movement of the character. And you of course saw that in the old, really old animation where people felt a little bit choppy when they moved, or the character, like Mickey Mouse or something like that, and so it kind of looked very limited to what the movement can do. But when you did it with film, since the individual images in the film's section was actually the person's natural movement, if you actually drew from those images the character, then you could create a character that would have the natural flowing movement of the person that was on film. And so you could still make an animation, have it relatively simple in image, but the movement would be a lot more precise. And I guess the technology was invented and patented by a gentleman, if I recall, was named Max Fleischer or something like that. And he did it for the animation purpose of creating images that were much more closer to real movement sort of style. And one of the earliest animations that used rotoscope was something called Coco the Clown, a character named Coco the Clown in the very classical animation series. I think it was Betty Boop. Right, and so Betty Boop, of course, is true traditional animation, and so there was a very animated classical style to both the movement and the character. But Coco the Clown, because it was a rotoscope that was kind of put on top of the Betty the Boop animation, his movement was a lot more fluid. And so it was very interesting that you could actually do this method. And in fact, it was a technology that kept on going for quite a while. The ones that I remember are, I think, the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds section of the animated movie, The Yellow Submarine. That abstract image was done using rotoscope, where the film was two people, a couple, kind of dancing together, in a waltz type of thing. And then they used really abstract drawings to superimpose that on top of the film, and then got rid of the film, and you had this very abstract image. The other one that I remember are the Ralph Bakshi, I can't remember, animations. You remember Wizards and the Lord of the Ring animation? That was done, if I recall, through rotoscope technology. So, yeah, I mean, you may not have realized it, but it has been used throughout the technology. And what Undone did is bring it to the digitized world. So first of all, of course, since it's digital, there is no film. But of course, there are still images, right? That's what digital movies are these days, or even digital animation, right? When you say FPS, or frames per second, you're talking about the individual frames of images that are coming out. And so what rotoscope brought was that they basically filmed the characters in real life doing those actions, and that's why the characters in Undone look so real and their expressions look so real, is because it was film. But then they took a massive number of oil painters who then took the film and created these still images from that using oil painting. And that is why, although it looks real and it looks in depth, it also has that very, very classical look and feel to it. And they wanted to do it throughout the entire scene. And so what I didn't know is that for a lot of these scenes, the scenery itself was also done separately through a computer-generated image sometimes. I think it was, from what I understand, sometimes it was the real image and they acted within the set, and then they basically just hand drew the set. But in certain areas where, all that weirdness is going on, there is no set, right? How do you make a set of that wacky thing where she's floating in space and then, the thing is all the space around her is cracking and turning into other thing? You can't do that, in real space. And so what they did is they computer generated that using CGI technology and created the frames for that background. Then, instead of showing that computer image from the generation, they had their set of oil painters again go in and rotoscope right onto the image of the set and create again a retro look to a very modern style. And so now if you think about it, all of those things are really hard to do if you didn't have CGI to do it, right? I mean, how do you actually create sceneries that blend and move from one another? And the other interesting thing is, yes, that image. You remember that time when, Alma was running down the hallway, and you actually saw the hall moving up, and then it would actually rotate around while Alma was also rotating around. That's a 3D rendition. And it's really hard to do, unless you actually have a 3D image. So that hallway is a 3D computer-generated image. Alma is really Rosa Salazar running down. But neither of them are used directly. Both of them are developed, and then they're given to the oil painters and actually painted. Now, what's interesting from what I saw in this extra bonus is that they use the oil painters' hand-drawn images, and to avoid having to have them make millions of the same thing to get the proper frame rate, the 3D CGI people then took those images that the oil painters did and split it into vector objects. And those vector objects still had that hand-drawn look and feel, but they were rotatable because they were geometric shapes. And by doing it that way, they didn't have to ask the oil painters to have to make zillions of paintings. By creating one object per section of that set, they could actually then repeat it, and using the geometrical locations of the set, create that entire image of the background. And within that, of course, they superimposed the rotoscope image of Alma running down the background. So you get to understand just how difficult it was. It's actually more complex than CGI, because you have a bunch of oil painters who then have to paint on top of the CGI, and then they have to give it back to the CGI people so that they can then repaint these hand-drawn images of the 3D images that they created, so that they had that done. And then, of course, they use the standard technologies of putting, that suit on that creates the 3D images of people running down, which is what they did with Alma. And they created Alma's image that way. But then they use the oil painters to come back again and rotoscope her image running down that rotoscoped computer-generated image of that hallway. Yes, that one single image sounded extremely complex, and yet when we look at it, it looks very simple. But it couldn't have been done just by rotoscope because of the fact that they couldn't get that 3D transition of moving things around. It couldn't have been done with just CGI because CGI doesn't give that hand-drawn, neat, classical look. It couldn't be done just by CGI and rotoscope because you still needed Rosa to run down, and then you still needed to rotoscope her image. So something as simple as her running down that hallway was way more complex than either the hand-drawn methodologies of traditional rotoscope or the computer-generated technologies of the modern. And so the technology that they called it, I guess, is 3D rotoscope technology. And with that, you get all of the advantages of the 3D effects that you see in modern films. But you do see it in a classical methodology that dates back and brings you back to the times of things like Bakshi or Yellow Submarine. But you also then get it in a far more greater depth because of the fact that each person's personality, character was done through live action films. And so I thought that this was very interesting. It took rotoscope to a far, far greater capability while retaining the classical look and feel that is characteristic of rotoscope technology. And so once you understand that, you appreciate what they did a lot more. It was nice. It was classical. It was great. And it was always interesting to see just how much character came out in the film, series, through things that looked hand-drawn. And you always had that question, I wonder how they did it, but you didn't really appreciate just how much work went into it until you understand how they did it. And now if you go back to it and look at all these images of various shots of things that are happening, then you start realizing, my God, the amount of work that went into this is amazing. Now, yes, this image, if you want to know where this image came from, because it sure didn't come out in the very last part of Undone, the first season. You weren't sure what Alma was looking at. This came out in part 2 of Undone. I didn't know about that either until I went back and was looking at various scenes for the rotoscope technology, and I found this. And with this, of course, you realize that it is a question even more, and you realize that the producers are trolling us. Because with images like this, we are further unsure whether Alma is seeing figments of her imagination, even with this image, or whether this is real because this is what she was waiting for. So I am looking forward to season 2, and I hope they don't answer that question. I hope they keep it open so that the audience remains as confused as the main character in her situation. And that will be so great because that will be so unique in how the story is told. And I hope they keep on using this 3D rotoscope technology because it does give this film or this series a very unique look that you don't see in a lot of other, even computer generated series we see now. Okay, well, that's it for my discussion for the evolution of Undone. And yeah, what did you think about the animation? What did you think about these extra shots? And how do you expect to want to see season 2 done? So if you can leave any comments in the comments section, I'd appreciate it. And once season 2 does come out, I'll try to see if I could get it and continue on with this. So, but in any case, thank you very much to every one of you who followed this series with me. I apologize I didn't do it in any sort of periodic structure. I just randomly brought them out. But I did enjoy this series, and I appreciate many of you who brought in input into a lot of discussions that we had. And I look forward to season 2, and I hope you join us at that time. And until then, happy anime watching, happy drama watching, and as always, Jaya, nice day, everyone.